Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Almassian. Today, I'm joined by Hekmat Aboukhater. He is a journalist for The Grey Zone and also a pro-Syria activist. And recently, he attended a workshop on Zoom, and it was about imposing sanctions on the Syrian people. And as you know, on Syriana Analysis, we put a special focus on the sanctions and its impact on the ordinary citizens in Syria, and especially after the deadly earthquake. In the aftermath, the United States Treasury declared that they will temporarily, for 6 months, freeze some of the sanctions against Syria in order to facilitate the arrival of humanitarian aid to Syria, which proved the previous point or initial argument that was these sanctions affected the delivery of humanitarian assistance to Syria, but there was so much lobbying against and opposition against the U.S. Department and Treasury for taking such a decision, and it seems that the United States will not will halt the pause on the lifting of some of these sanctions. And for that, today I'm joined by Hekmat Aboukhater. Hekmat, thank you very much, first of all, for joining me. You actually attended a workshop that was attended by Syrian opposition figures in the United States, and they spoke about the sanctions, especially in the aftermath of the earthquake, the Caesar Act. And you attended it, you heard them, you listened to them. Were you invited? Why did you attend, first of all, this workshop, and were you invited to this workshop?
Well, thank you, Kevork, for having me. I was definitely not invited. I crashed this event. So I followed them on their social media, and I saw that they were marketing this event that was about to happen. It was happening on the past Sunday, the 30th. And the event was marketed as mobilizing for HR 3201 in-district engagement workshop. And throughout that event, I was able to essentially see the anti-Syria lobby firsthand. And eventually, after I crashed and I listened and I took some notes on how this lobby operates, at the final moment, I engaged with the main speaker, Wael Zayat, who is a notorious State Department cutout. And eventually I was kicked out because I shouted at him.
Yeah, I think Wael Zayat, he wrote an article that says on the Washington Post, he published it on the 9th of February 2023. It says, "Don't lift sanctions on Syria to help earthquake victims."
Absolutely, yeah. This guy, during this presentation, I'll dive deeper into his character and his just moral questionable character, and just the path that he's taken in life and how he ended up spouting such horrendous nonsense and such horrendous talking points against his own fellow Syrians still living in Syria. So yeah, we will. I'll dive deeper into that and tell you how we eventually engaged in a shouting match with him and got kicked out of the Zoom call.
Yeah, but this conference or Zoom call was organized by the Syrian American Council, and they're based in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. So let me go ahead and jump then. So the Syrian American Council is a neoconservative aligned advocacy 501c3 organization in Washington, and they essentially they've become very vocal voice, supposedly speaking for Syrians in Washington, starting in 2012 in the aftermath of the uprising in Syria and the civil war, the commencement of the dirty war in Syria. And for the last 12 years of the war, they have been one of the most vocal voices for an American intervention in Syria. They've been completely on the side of all the dirty war aspects of the Syrian war. They've been supporters of any form of funding of armed rebels, moderate or not. And yeah, they are, as you can see here, I've clipped some of their influence in Washington. They essentially have an open slate. They can pretty much submit op-eds to the Washington Post, to the New York Times whenever they want to. This includes some of their funding. They've funded God knows where from, about $1.7 million over the past 5 years, non-taxable because they're a 501c3, supposedly doing good for the world as a nonprofit. And they're currently run by Susan Meridian. Susan Meridian is the current director of community and partner relations. She was the one leading the event. She was the one speaking here and
I've seen so much laughter on their faces as well while they were talking about sanctions.
that's
It
the thing.
feels weird.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's asinine to me. I lived in Syria up until 2015, and for me to just hear every day about how my fellow Syrians, they wish for the war to come back rather than the sanctions to be lifted. Essentially, they prefer the war over the sanctions, because at least in the war they know what is causing their life risk. But these people just, they seem so disconnected from their fellow Syrians that, yeah, it's just, it was, there's a lot of acrimony in these laughs, so I wouldn't take them at face
I
value.
I would go further and say they're committing murder because when you slowly kill any individual in Syria, whether it's pro-government or anti-government, and these people need to understand that probably a percentage and considerable percentage of the people living in government-held areas are probably also they don't like the government, so they're being also punished for just living in government-held areas and not living in so-called rebel-held areas.
Yeah, that's why whenever I do a presentation, whenever I do any advocacy or activism, I try to include these pictures here that you see in the background, showing
Mhm.
just the effect of damage that has been caused on Syria because of the earthquake, because of the war, because of the sanctions. And these people, I don't know if I would call them murderers as well, but I just think that they're so focused on their internal grievances. That's, many of them, they might have legit grievances against the government, but they're so focused on these grievances that they've become sectarian actors that essentially forget that the majority of the Syrian people are suffering because of their supposed advocacy, because of conversations like these that happen in corners in Washington with these Syrian Americans. Millions and millions of Syrians in Aleppo, in Damascus, in Latakia, in Tartus are just suffering because of their supposed advocacy.
Yeah. So can you walk us through what did they speak during this workshop? What were they training the people who attended this workshop, and for what they are advocating? How are they going to speak with their representatives in the United States, and what are they going to tell them, and how are they going to convince to impose further sanctions on Syria?
Yeah, let me just quickly finish up introducing the different actors here, and
Hmm.
then we'll jump right into it. So Susan Meridian here, you can see one of her op-eds, opinion pieces for the Atlantic Council, none other, essentially saying "From Syria with Love" to Senator McCain. Senator McCain, who's photographed with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi,
Hmm.
the notorious caliph of ISIS. They do activism against the only honest journalist in Washington, like Max Blumenthal, who's trying to write a book about the influence of Washington in the Syrian dirty war. They censor his book, and as you can
And
see here, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
And for those who don't know, the Atlantic Council is it belongs to NATO, and it's the mouthpiece of NATO. And she's writing for an outlet thanking Senator McCain for supporting, quote unquote, the Syrian people. And here we have to understand that the Syrian people here are the ones who were ready to carry arms and fight against the Syrian government. And the vast majority of them are ideologues, and they believe in a Salafi Takfiri state, which means the allegation that when you support an Islamist or a Taliban-like or Al-Qaeda-minded militant in Syria, this person is not going to remove the so-called dictatorship in Syria and then say, welcome guys, you guys who are sitting in Washington D.C. dressing up nice and wearing suits and ties, and come and rule Syria. Those who carry out the fight is the one who is going to rule Syria.
Exactly the same fallacy of supporting quote unquote moderate rebels that never existed.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the directorship of the Syrian American Council.
Hmm.
After Suzanne Meridian, right after her, you see none other than this lady here, and
Hmm.
she has the same last name as well. I don't personally know if she's his wife, but one can only assume that she is, and one can only figure out that there's a huge conflict of interest here, where you're seeing people getting paid salaries, inviting their husbands to go do speakership
Hmm.
fees. It's just the whole thing is convoluted, and obviously they're happy to be supported and sustained by taxpayer dollars and pay each other these fees for supposed activism that's saving the world.
So if we want to say they have like two motivations here, the first motivation is their hatred toward the Syrian regime, and the second is financial motivation here.
Yeah, again, it's grievance based. I would not deny that, but it's sectarian based that now ignores all the facts on the ground, ignores the reality of their fellow Syrians. As you can see here, again, don't lift sanctions on Syria to help earthquake victims. This op-ed, he eventually changed the name. The Washington Post probably forced him to change the name.
No, actually, it was too low even for Wael Zayat. For a personality like him, I think when he published this first on Twitter, the people even on the opposite side of Syria, they were blaming him for such a title and saying that at least change the title so that it looks more diplomatic, and not so bold that kill the Syrian people and don't lift the sanctions. It's so obvious here.
Yeah. So these are the type of people, and this here is the person who is the main speaker for this event. Wael Zayat, another quick factoids about him. He's the Middle East Institute Senior Fellow. We all know the Middle East Institute, supported by Gulf nations and just the likes of Charles Lister. He's a companion of Wael Zayat. Engage, a foundation supposedly pushing for activism and Muslim civic involvement in American politics. But when you dig deeper, you see that it's supported by Open Society Foundation, by Meta, by just the worst actors in American society and American politics. They are supposedly activating the Muslim vote, which I highly doubt. And you go on Engage's website, no mention of Palestine. No mention whatsoever. The only advocacy they do is against the Chinese government because of the Uyghur situation. So the thing that matters to American Muslims, not even one mention of Jerusalem, not even one mention of Palestine. So these are the types of people that, and of course you can see that he's a regular at Al Jazeera.
Yeah, so he's a more neocon affiliated character in the United States with great empathy and sympathy with the Zionist lobby as well there.
Exactly. He also worked for the State Department for 10 years, and he somehow is proud about that. And he says that he served in the American embassy in occupied Iraq. He worked under people like Samantha Powers, the notorious neocon who gladly bragged about an entire division of the Syrian army being blasted by mistake by United States Air Force. Some of his amazing quotes here that he writes for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is another AIPAC-related organization in Washington that pushes pro-Israel legislation and policy. He said, essentially, the U.S. policy of John Kerry and Obama has failed. The administration needs urgently a comprehensive approach towards Iran centered in Syria and Iraq, including military means, to restore regional stability. Advocating for military means to destroy the actual arc of resistance from Iran to Syria to Iraq, and calling it regional stability is just it's wild. And then he continues with his quote: otherwise new disasters, fueling extremism, and likely new WMD programs. This guy believes the lies of the Bush administration that weapons of mass destruction were being built and used in Iraq. This guy is a neocon that somehow has found himself weaseling his way into advocacy for the Syrian people.
What is his nationality? Is he Syrian, Wael Zayat, or he's Syrian?
But he's been out of Syria for a long time. I don't even think he was in Syria when the war started. So to think to anyone in Syria, if you ask anyone on the streets of Syria, even in Idlib, like I'll give you that, even in Idlib, even in the northwest, and you say, what do you think about the United States invasion of Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction, famous lie, they would disagree with this guy. It's insane. So yeah, final note, Engage, the organization that he runs that we talked about has received $1,075,000 directly from the Open Society Foundation.
So we can also say here that Wael Zayyat and his group and advocacy group who had a role in destroying Iraq on the pretext of WMD and changing the regime and creating the chaos and the power vacuum which led to the rise of ISIS. It was IS first in Iraq.
Mm.
Those are the same forces who are trying to remove the leadership in Damascus to create similar power vacuum, which gives me the impression that the policy in Iraq under Bush, that wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate policy to create a power vacuum, because if it was a mistake and the Washington planners know that that was a mistake, then they wouldn't repeat the same thing in Syria.
Yeah, it's just asinine to see people like him showing up all polite with his nice button down and just speaking with almost like a Pennsylvanian accent
Hmm.
and discussing the role of the United States in the Middle East, ignoring completely the historical role that the United States has had in the Middle East. It's just absolutely disgusting.
Yeah.
For more about him, we don't have enough time to discuss Wael Zayyat and his character. More about him, the Electronic Intifada have done a series of excellent investigative articles about him, his work with Mgage, and how he co-ops the Muslim advocacy and civic voice in the United States for Zionist aims, for interventionist neoconservative aims. Okay, so now we're at the bill, House Resolution 3201, which essentially extends the Caesar Act terrorist sanctions, the inhumane sanctions on Syria to 10 more years. So the Caesar Act was supposed to come to an end around 2020. I believe, I'm forgetting the number now, but they essentially extended for 10 more years to 2032.
Yeah.
And this policy is now being pushed through Congress, and that's why this workshop took place. Essentially, making use of this recess where the congressmen and congresswomen are back in their states, where these SAC members would go and meet with them and discuss why it's so important for the United States to just essentially keep its knee on the neck of the Syrian people and not only extend the sanctions, but HR 3201 also pushes against any form of normalization that might happen in the Middle East with the Syrian government. This is a quick quote from Joshua Landis at the Quincy Institute. And he writes, Arab League members seem to have concluded that efforts to isolate and overthrow Assad have failed and that the current policy is making things worse. So long as the Syrian economy remains in ruins, more refugees will flow out of the country, the illegal drug trade will increase, and more Syrians will join radical groups. They argue that only engagement and a path for the traumatized Syrian people to rebuild their lives can begin to reverse these trends and also undercut Assad's dependency on Iran. The analysis, as commensal as it may be, will not dissuade sectarian actors in the SAC from their rabid quest for vengeance against Assad government in Syria and any Syrian who remains in the majority of Syria under the president's control. These are my own words. The quote ends here. Sorry, but essentially, anyone in Washington who is not bought by the anti-Syrian lobby, or who's not motivated by neo-hawk and neoconservative motives, understands that this is the way forward. If you want stability, if you actually care about human rights, you just let Syria slowly rebuild, and you'd let Syria slowly take back its position in the Middle East, and you'd let its neighbors do whatever they want to do with Syria. That is not what the bill advocates for. The bill advocates for essential undercutting on any form of renormalization and further sanctioning of the Syrian government, forcing 90% of the Syrian population to remain under the poverty line.
And by the way, Joshua Landis is also being targeted to harsh criticism, and I would say it is organized criticism on social media platforms, trying to shame him for his recent opinions on the sanctions against the Syrian people.
Absolutely. That's why you see certain voices that advocate for common sense policy on Syria, and then you fast forward a couple of years and they've been silenced. that's definitely what's going to happen to Joshua Landis as well. So here are the policy priorities, Kevork. We'll go through them really quickly, but this is essentially what the workshop was pushing its members to advocate for when they're having these in-person meetings with their representatives. So first, restore U.S. leadership in the region, re-energize diplomatic track. So they say that they want to re-energize the diplomatic track, but then immediately in the next couple of sentences, they talk about a ceasefire. Who will enforce this ceasefire? If they put a ceasefire essentially banning the Syrian government from engaging Idlib, or banning the Syrian government from engaging the illegal U.S. military bases in the country, who's going to enforce it? They're essentially asking for further military entanglement for the United States Army in Syria. Another point, they want to appoint a seasoned Syria envoy to help reinvigorate this political track. One can only assume what type of Syrian seasoned envoy would be. It would definitely be a war hawk. It would be someone that's probably Wael Zayat trying to bid for another job to have in Washington where taxpayers pay him, so that he can go to Washington and just push for Lockheed Martin's interest, for Northrop interest, and for essentially the weapons manufacturers to use their weapons on Syrians in Syria. Do you have any notes on
Yes, actually, the type of ceasefire that they're calling for is, we say on the surface it looks good, but in the core it's very tricky, because what they're advocating for, when you impose, like, nobody can impose ceasefire in Syria except for Russia, right? And the Syrian army. If the Syrian army decides to hold its guns and not to shoot, they will do it. There is a decision that comes from Damascus. At the same time, the Russians can negotiate with Damascus and convince Damascus, right? Those are the two parties, I believe, are able to enforce ceasefire in Syria. But if there is, let's say, a so-called international or UN resolution to impose a ceasefire, let's say in Idlib, or in northern Syria, or in Al Tanaf border crossing, or in eastern Syria, those are meant to freeze the conflict so that these regions could establish a new de facto rules in these parts of Syria, so that they pave the way and prepare the grounds for future division of Syria based on this region. So the Kurdish region, or a region in the north that is based on the elements of the former FSA, Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, ISIS elements, etc., etc. If you freeze these fronts and you allow Al-Qaeda to establish and reinforce its authority in certain areas, they will change the demographics of this area. They will establish new realities on the ground in a way that the Syrian army, not even in decades, can liberate these areas or reinforce the sovereignty of Damascus in the future. Whoever was the leader, we're not talking about Assad. Let's suppose in 10 years Assad is not here. There will be new realities on the ground that nobody will be able to change. That's the purpose of this so-called ceasefire.
Absolutely. They have three goals out of this supposed policy here. Help Turkey annex northwestern Syria, help the Kurdish rump in northeast Syria that essentially cannot exist as a state on its own. It is a desert. It doesn't have any water access. So, but they are pushing the Kurds to try and establish a country that will never be fully sustainable, and trying to push them away from the Assad government. And the third is to try and force the United States to maintain their military presence in the United States indefinitely.
Yeah.
100% agree with you. Second point, second policy priority is countering normalization. For this one, the only thing that immediately comes to mind is why not let the governments and monarchies in the region make their own decision? Why are we, after 12 years where we forced the governments of Qatar, the government of Turkey, the governments of Saudi Arabia to foot the bill for this dirty war that ravaged Syria and killed almost 500,000 people? We know that it didn't work. Now they're trying something new. The countries in this neighborhood are trying something new with Syria. Why are they not allowed to do so? Exactly what Joshua Landis said. This is only angering the supposed allies of the United States in the region further, because they just have their own agenda now. They want to renormalize relations. They understand that there's a lot of good to be gained out of renormalization, but the United States decides that from oceans away, from continents away, it has a say here. And what can you do?
Unfortunately, you cannot do anything at the moment, or very little that we can do. But I can foresee clearly that with the changes that happened after the proxy war in Ukraine, the U.S. will be forced at some point to prioritize its efforts, and its main enemies are Russia and China. Therefore, the main hotspots will be focused on Ukraine and Taiwan, and the United States will have to decrease its involvement in different parts of the world, because the U.S. empire has passed through almost all the stages of any empire that can. At the first decade and two, it was increasing in power. It reached to the peak with the Iraq war and then the Libya war. But then we are now living in the phase of a decline. It's you cannot measure how fast is the U.S. empire is falling, but it is understandable, and it's very clear that the U.S. is losing its grip in different geopolitical conflicts in the world, and that is why the US is acting hysterically with its allies, for example, in Europe, forcing them to fight or do the bit of the US against Russia, and also in Far East Asia against China. So my analysis is here. In a decade or two, they can now, of course, kill more people in Syria with these sanctions. That is horrible. But on the long run, I foresee that they cannot sustain this sanction policy and bulldogging against smaller countries, because if the international monetary system has collapsed and the BRICS countries establish a new financial systems and link Syria to these financial systems and the transactions that could happen to Syria, whether it's in yuan or it's in ruble or in any other currency, then the sanctions will be just an ink on a paper.
Yep.
The US sanctions. This is what I foresee, but unfortunately, this is a
long way
term fight.
Yeah, yeah, and exactly what you said here. Syria can never find peace or be stabilized with Assad in power. The only barrier to peace and stabilization is the criminal sanctions on Syria, and everyone knows this. So the fact that they would put such a blatant lie here is just, again, asinine. And again, like, I care for the United States. I care for the American people. Why should we have tax money that we pay for go towards pushing embassies around the Middle East against normalization?
Yeah,
we have no interest in this region further than what destruction we've already caused.
No, this is not in the interest of the United States. This is in the interest of Israel, and I will be very honest with you. The United States doesn't have a national security interest in Syria. Syria doesn't pose a national security interest against the United States, but rather because Syria represents an important player in an axis that provides material support and tangible support to the armed groups that are resisting against the Israeli occupation in different parts, in different Arabic countries, whether it's in Lebanon or Palestine or even Syria.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah, yeah. Point 3, Kevork, establishing an accountability mechanism. This point, I have not much other than trying to push back. Like, where's the accountability for Samantha Powers, who, as I mentioned before, gladly smirked off the fact that an entire division of young men fighting for the Syrian army were wiped out by a drone attack by mistake.
Yeah.
Where's for his boss, Samantha Powers? Where's the accountability for McCain, who is lauded by Susan, who met with al-Baghdadi and supported the supposed moderate rebels in Syria? Accountability for these types of actors only goes one way. So
Yeah.
it is meant to be completely ignored, not taken seriously, because they are the first ones who would defend the abhorrent actions that their supposed resistance and opposition committed in Syria. So these points should be ignored on there, and they merit no basis of discussion.
And about accountability, there are two things I think they believe in. The first accountability mechanism that they are pushing is to impose further sanctions against the Assad regime, quote unquote, so that we want to punish them. But any sane person who goes to Syria and walks in the streets and talks with the people in different types of people, we're not talking about ethnicity, color, race, but we just go to different geographies in Syria and see how these sanctions are affecting directly the people and not the regime officials, right? And secondly, so this is complete failure, and they know it is a failure because it's affecting the people more than the leadership. But the second one is, are they going to send Assad to the ICC? Okay. ICC doesn't have a jurisdiction over Syria, but they can enforce it through UN Security Council resolution. So the Chinese and the Russian side will veto. So this is also a dead end. So what they're basically saying, we will continue our failed policy that is killing Syrian people indefinitely until the international conditions change in a way that the US is ready now to intervene in Syria directly and remove Assad from power. And I can assure you, Hekmat, that if this didn't happen in 2013, it will never happen after 2023, especially after the Ukraine war. Syria is so much protected now from Russia and Iran and other allies that the United States itself doesn't dare to attack Syria because it doesn't, as I mentioned, represent a geopolitical, big geopolitical value for the United States. It represents a big geopolitical value for Israel. So for the US itself, also going to war in Syria just for Israel, just like they did with Iraq in 2003, it doesn't make sense because in 2003, the US was in its peak power. The United States is not in its peak power now. They cannot go and invade other countries and without any resistance, let's say, from the international community, which is not only the Europe and Australia and the United States, as some people think. The international community is over 195 countries and not only 30 countries or 32 countries, as some people tend to believe.
Yeah. So many things here. First of all, United States is not a signatory on the ICC, so they are not allowed to send anyone there.
Yeah.
They wouldn't send Bush there. And I absolutely agree with you. It's no longer the United States is no longer the only hegemon. There are other powers in the world, and we're just on the friction points of these powers. As Syrians, we need to acknowledge this. We're just cogs in the game. But these people are happy placing Syria in this cog, and they're just fueling, like oiling the machinery so that the Syrian people keep getting grinded into a pulp. And they don't realize that anything that they're pushing for is just going to maintain the misery that people live under. So, Kevork, point number 4 here, as you can see here, direct assistance to Syrians in need. Wael now makes another preposterous point, saying the United States needs to push further and fund further the Syrians in need, but focus that he only concentrates on the Syrian people living in the northwest. He only focuses on the area supposedly hosting 4 million people in the northwest region of Syria, essentially Idlib. Who is benefiting from this? This is public information. Anyone can go and check U.S. foreign assistance by country. Who is benefiting from the almost $1 billion that's being sent to Syria annually? Look, this is over the past 7 years, 8 years, let's say, since the war. Every single year, almost $1 billion are going to Syria. It is not the Syrians living in Aleppo. It is not the Syrians living in Damascus. It is not the majority of Syrians, the over 10 million Syrians that are living under the Syrian government currently in the major cities. The majority of the money is either going to fund supposed moderate groups, or it's going directly to Idlib, directly to the Rojava region of Syria. That money is already being sent. What do you mean direct assistance, further direct assistance? Is $1 billion a year not enough?
Hmm.
It's just
And there is no mechanism to follow up on where this money is spent on
absolutely.
in especially in a place like Idlib. If you take Idlib and the geography at Idlib and check all the checkpoints and all the military sites, you will see that over 90% of them are for HDS, and HDS is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, previously
Al-Qaeda.
known as Al-Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
So when you send over $1 billion per year to Idlib, there is no way, logically speaking, that this money will go directly only to humanitarian purposes or to help the Syrian people there. I believe if $1 billion is spent on Idlib, the people in Idlib would be now living very high in a very high standards. And second point here is the demographics of Idlib is very interesting because I've been following the statements since 2016 after the liberation of Aleppo. They started with saying Idlib has 1.5 million people living there, and then a year later it became 2 million, and then 3 million, and now they're speaking 4 million. It's either the people there are multiplying like rabbits, or they are exaggerating with the numbers. Because remember what happened in Aleppo, in eastern Aleppo, when there was an effort to liberate Aleppo, and they said 1.5 million people are stuck, and Assad is going to butcher them, and people are throwing themselves from the balconies, and there is ethnic cleansing, blah 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 blah. And of 1.5 million people that they said live there, the numbers were not even over 200,000 people. So most of the people that came out of eastern Aleppo, and there was a counting mechanism because there were monitors from different parts of the world. They were monitors and observers from over 20 countries there in eastern Aleppo when the people were trying to escape that part. And the vast majority of the people, they have chosen to stay and live with the government. Those who were supposedly the arch enemies of Assad, and they were saying that these people hate Assad, etc. They prefer to stay in their homes, to go back to Eastern Aleppo after the liberation and live there. The number of the people who chose to be bused and just take this green bus and go to Idlib, it's
Mm.
not over 10,000 people. And those are the militants and their families.
Yeah.
So this is a point that everybody don't want to speak about, the
Yeah.
context of these numbers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Georg, as we talked on Useful Idiots, you and I with Aaron and Katie.
Mm-hmm.
So my family and I, the reason we ended up leaving Aleppo is because of the siege of Aleppo that lasted for 3 years. We were in the midst of the siege in 2014, and we just decided it's unlivable. The situation in Aleppo is no longer livable, and for me to hear people discuss the liberation of Aleppo in such cynical ways, it's just like every day the experience of a Syrian person who actually lived through the war in Syrian cities is the experience of someone watching the world through tinted glasses, mirrored glasses, because seeing that everything that is advocated by the United States, everything that's advocated by these supposed advocacy groups, is a complete opposite of
Yeah.
their lived experience. The one quick last note on this one, Kivwork, this specific policy priority also pushes the SAC members to push their representatives to co-sponsor the Stop UN Support for Assad Act, HR 4868. That is the most preposterous thing in this policy priority, because what is the only institution that is currently keeping the remaining Syrians in Syria from starvation? It's the United Nations. And that is the only form of direct assistance that's actually getting to Syrians. So they're, in one hand, advocating for direct assistance to Syrians only in the northwest, while at the same time damning all the other Syrians, the majority of the Syrians living in the major cities, living under the Syrian government, to starvation. And essentially saying the only program that's feeding you, the United Nations, should be stopped.
And here comes all these rumors that they are purposely, deliberately are planting in the media, and by saying that the humanitarian aid that the UN is delivering to Syria is being stolen by the Assad regime. And this is the most ridiculous allegation ever. And like, imagine that the Assad regime is stealing the humanitarian aid for what? to feed its family? Like, do they think the Assad regime is just the Assad family, for example, and few families, and they are eating this food and this medication? It's like these people are so ridiculous that they think the regime with so many security apparatuses, with one of the strongest military armies in the Middle East, that's true. That's true. That needs to steal the humanitarian assistance from the UN in order to pump up its situation or conditions or solidify the pillars of this so-called regime. This is deliberate planting of false information in the media in order to, as you mentioned, this new act, Stop UN Support for Assad Act. This is the purpose of it.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And Kevork, even if, let's say, in a most cynical scenario, 70% of this aid that's coming from the United Nations is being stolen and is being resold by the Syrian government, who else is going to feed the Syrians who are immiserated in Syria? Our wheat is controlled by the United States. We're not being able to harvest it. The situation in Ukraine is making it that no wheat exports are getting to Syria. People are literally starving in Syria. Even if 30%, let's say, of these actual UN aid food baskets are arriving in Syria, are you advocating that people just go hungry? Is a point that just enrages someone reading these policy priorities. It's absolutely disgusting.
Yeah.
Point 5, countering Assad's Captagon trade, the classic. Now we've all heard enough about Captagon, which is essentially like a poor man's cocaine, as described by many medical journals. Essentially, this point is so cynical because it we'll show this later on when we show the supposed mock interviews, but this point pushes these Syrian American Council members to remind specifically exclusively conservative members of Congress that they have an anti-drug stance, essentially reversing back to the war on drugs mentality to try and remind these conservative politicians in the United States, like, hey, you're against drugs, right? You're against legalization of weed. So here's what you should do: sanction the Syrian government because Captagon. Sanction the Syrian government because we also don't want illicit drugs to get into our country. Spouting during this conversation, they were, as I was saying, something essentially along the lines of like, Captagon is spreading to Eastern Europe. Some of it is even reaching the United States. And this is such a national security interest of the United States government that we should impose more sanctions and oppose the Captagon trade in any way possible. The only thing that actually matters to them is finding any way that the Syrian economy is functioning and trying to cut it at the throat.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
If I don't say the term unbelievable, otherwise I will rant and start slander, saying some slanders in Arabic. So better continue.
Yeah, we'll touch back on this later. For the mock interview, it was so funny. Yeah. I'll show it later, but essentially they were meeting with a Congressman, Andy Biggs, here. This was like a little workshop we did. And essentially, because he's a Republican from Arizona, they said that the way to tackle him, the way to convince him that we should sanction Syria is by saying, like, hey, Andy Biggs, like, you hate drugs, we hate drugs. We're Syrians. That makes sense, right? Yeah, it's disgusting.
And probably Wael Zayed goes home and then he sniffs a line of cocaine, right? After this brilliant achievement that he has done. We should ask him for some blood test now.
Maybe. It's just, I don't know how these people live with themselves. Final point, expedite resettlement of Syrian refugees. I don't have any points on this one. So yeah, Kevork, this is essentially it. The mock interview at the end, as I told you, they put us into small groups and they trained us on what points of the U.S. Constitution we should revert back to, what tweets we should focus on, how to search for any legislation that they've supported and align it with legislation that is targeted against Syria. And look, they even focus on the caucuses. They're like, oh, look at what caucuses they're involved in. If they're involved in Freedom Caucus, then you should be careful, because these people are typically non-interventionist. So essentially, they go by a bunch of examples where they go one by one and they teach how to deal with a Democrat who's non-interventionist, how to deal with someone who is a potential like Freedom Caucus member, how to deal with someone who's part of a progressive caucus, and how to convince each one of those different members that supporting these sanctions against Syria, supporting these anti-Syria bills are for the benefit of the United States and for the benefit of the world, essentially. Which
basically
is
persuading them, right?
Yeah, essentially working as lobbyists. And the most ridiculous thing is that none of these people are registered as lobbyists. Because what country would you register as lobbyists for? If it were to me, I would say they're registered as lobbyists for Saudi Arabia, for Israel, for Qatar, but they're not. They're technically just only an advocacy group.
Crazy. Do you want me to show the video that this 1 minute video that you spoke with Wael Zayyat, or it's too early now to show that?
No, I'm done, Kivork. I did what I had. And
okay, if you stop sharing from your side, I will. So, guys, our friend Hekmat Aboukhater, he sat with them and he actually break in this conversation, and he recorded it. He took screenshots and slides for us to see how this group works, the advocacy group, which is basically lobbying and group. And at the end of the conversation, or the so-called workshop, he wanted to deliver a message to Wael Zayyat. So I will play what he said to Wael Zayyat, and we comment on that.
I have a quick question. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Just quick question for Wael. Wael, I read your work a lot for the Washington Post, and was wondering how direct and how forceful should we be with our requests? Because I remember when you wrote your op-ed, you said don't lift sanctions on Syria to help earthquake victims. You were so crude in your statement, and you were so forceful that you just emphasized that your opinions and your support, your financial support that you get from the Imperial United States is so much more important than the lives of Syrians living within the major cities of Aleppo, Homs, and Damascus, and Latakia, and Tartus. And should we all be the same? Should we also all be spineless demons?
All right.
Should we all be demons the same way that you are, Wael? Should we all be soulless folks?
That's where I got kicked out. I wish I had prepared a better statement, but I was just in the moment when I realized that I had to jump in and say something because the workshop was almost over. I just was enraged, and that was just blinding any clear thought that I had in mind. And I just wanted to make it clear that this is what he was doing. He was putting his own interests, his own sectarian views on how Syria should be and how the world should be, putting it and valuing it more than the lives of the majority of Syrians, the tens of millions of Syrians living in the big cities and living in the majority of Syria that's under the Syrian government control. So my fellow Syrians living in Aleppo, my friends and family living in Damascus, my friends and family living in Latakia and Tartus, each one of those people flashed in my view when I saw his smirk as I quoted his article. And I saw how he reacted with a smirk. He was like, another Syrian activist saying that my title was not appropriate. And when I saw that smirk, I was just enraged by the way his raison d'etre is just astonishing to me.
Hekmat, as much as we try to be civilized with them, but there is no way, in my opinion, knowing what they're doing to the Syrian people. If you have any conscience, if you have any dignity, if you have any human feelings towards the Syrian people, you would do what you did and more than that. And when Wael Zayat wrote his famous article, "Don't lift sanctions on Syria to help earthquake victims," I tagged him on Twitter. And I called him a terrorist, and he was very unhappy about that. And he said, no, he didn't write the title of the article. He tried to lie because they changed the title later, and thankfully I had a screenshot of it. So he even tried to lie about the title of the article. But why I called him a terrorist? Because this approach of threatening the Syrian people with more sanctions is terrorizing them. It's an act of terror against millions of people in Syria and telling them, because you foiled the regime change war in Syria, because you stood by your government or you were silent and you didn't participate in this so-called revolution, you're going to be punished. And you're not going to be punished a year or two. Now we are extending it for another 10 years. This is an act of terror because you're terrorizing millions of people. You are inflicting heavy physical, psychological pain on the Syrian people. Therefore, Hekmat, I'm sure you're going to watch this video, and I will make sure that you receive this video through my ways. So I would say, yes, you are a terrorist, you're an imbecile, you are a person who have sold your soul to the neocons, to the Zionist lobby, to the Qatari lobby in the United States. We know what you do. We know what you are acting. And I'm sure that you were surprised and shocked what Hekmat did, which is any Syrian, patriotic Syrian, I believe, would have done what he did, but he was smart and he infiltrated your ranks, and he took some nice screenshots for us so that also we know how you work and all our suspicions about your work as a lobbyist and not a journalist, because you're not a journalist, you're a lobbyist. You write for mainstream media in the United States in the form of lobbying and persuading the American administration to take certain decisions that serve only you and your hatred toward the Syrian regime, and also fill the pockets of your pockets and also the pockets of all the imbeciles that participated with you in this workshop, because these people have sold their souls. Even if you hate the Syrian regime, this doesn't justify you slowly killing millions of Syrians. So this would be my message to them. Hekmat, for the people who would like to follow your work, first of all, I would like to invite them to follow you on Twitter on the handler What the Hekmat. I will put the link of your Twitter account in the description below. I will also put the link of your YouTube account in the description below. Guys, it's very important to support people like Hekmat in his work, in his journalistic work, and in his attempt to expose such characters, because at the end of the day, if you have a million people telling lies and you have only one person telling the truth, this one person can counter a million people, because the truth has a power and there is an energy in it, and the people around the world can feel the truth has a positive energy, the lie has a negative energy, and the people are not stupid. If you put now Hekmat and this Wael Zayat together in front for debate face to face, the people can judge, people can feel who is whose heart is for the Syrian people and whose heart for the American dollar. People can know. This is, you cannot hide it, and that's why people like Zayat and others, they fight against independent journalists. They try to discredit them. They try to ban their books. They do everything because they have no other way to silence them, because the truth is so powerful that they cannot counter it unless they censor them and they block them and they deplatform them. That's their way.
Yeah, very well put, Kevork. And my last point is that the entire event, the workshop, it was attended by less than 30 people. And those 30 people are so vocal, and they're so sponsored by the United States State Department, the United States Pentagon, the United States CIA, FBI. Every major institution supports them so much that they end up causing so much suffering for their fellow Syrians living in Syria. They discontinued the general license on the sanctions. They're pushing that this bill is most likely going to pass, HR 3201 202. It's most likely going to pass. Unfortunately, not much we can do about it. And this is it. Like, there's so few people that are causing so much hate, so much grievance, so much suffering for so many people. I just hope this changes at some point.
Hekmat, I'm only 36 years old. I'm probably a little bit older than you, but I can assure you from this very short life experience, everything I have done in my life, it came around. I'm not a perfect person, right? I have done good things and I have done bad things. Whenever I did a good thing for somebody or some people or more people, it always came around in a good way. And every time I did something bad, it came around in a bad way to me. So what goes around comes around. And these people, as much as they fill their pockets, they will pay for it. They will pay for their health. They will pay for their children. They will pay for it sooner or later. And if they don't pay it in a physical or harm way, their reputation and their image in front of the Syrian people. Nowadays, when I post the videos, for example, of this Syrian American consul, when they went to the Congress to convince them to reimpose the sanctions, you can see like what's the general mood in Syria, right? The people were commenting under this video and say, I fucking hate Assad. I wish he dies and everything. But these people are demons. We live in Aleppo, we live in Hama, we live in Homs. We hate Assad. That doesn't make any difference for us. That you guys are killing us. We are with you and you're killing us in Syria. So this is also, I think they should, I'm sure they know it, but it's a message that we have to send anyways.
Absolutely.
Hekmat, I'm very happy to have you on Syriana Analysis, and I would like to thank you for what you did. You're a very brave person for doing this, and I also would like to thank you for trusting me with your material and sharing this experience with Syriana Analysis, which is very important and means a lot to me. I will send this video for transcription also. I will try to find people in Syria to do the transcription and the translation, and I will pay for them in Syria.
I can do
in my own ways. I want to pay these people in Syria. We need to translate this in Arabic and post it also on Facebook and probably on some Syrian outlets so that everybody can understand how these so-called Syrian lobbyists are working in the United States against the Syrian people. Thank you very much, Hekmat.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevok.